Greta and the Labrador, a poem in 8 fits. Miss Greta Garbo was her name, and no one rivalled her for fame. Her beauty was beyond compare, her gleaming skin, her lustrous hair, her eyes which seemed about to weep, her lips which kept young lads from sleep, her noble brow, her marble cheek, her chin which made strong men go weak. And yet it was not one sole feature which made her such a glorious creature. The whole was greater than its parts. She ravished countless aching hearts. One writer said it loud and clear, "Miss Garbo's face is an idea." The movies cast her as a queen. She shone on every silver screen, from Hollywood to her own Sweden, like a new Eve in a new Eden. And though she seemed as cold as snow, men burned with a desire to know the paradise beneath her dresses, the promised bliss of her caresses, while women craved for all she'd got. But was she happy? She was not. No human form gave her delight. She'd howl with rage through each long night, and all day long she'd sit and moan, "I simply want to be alone." The movie men were all distraught to see the Swedish swan they'd caught now slumped down on her plaster throne, demanding to be left alone. So, seeing how she wept and sighed, they gathered round her and all cried, "Just tell us how we can atone!" "You fools, I want to be alone." "All right, so maybe we'll postpone." "Get lost, I want to be alone." She craved it as a dog a bone, her only wish to be alone. The movie men were racked with woe. They knew they'd have to let her go. And so she fled the pleasure dome of Hollywood and went back home. And so she cast away her fame, though fans lamented, "What a shame!" Flew to the town where she was born, and felt a little less forlorn. But not for long. Her lovely face was dear to all the Swedish race, and every day some smiling Swede, not knowing of her burning need for quiet, would stop her in the street and say, "How wonderful to meet the loveliest woman in the world." She was not pleased. She simply whirled around and fled back to her flat. No peace in Stockholm, that was that. Once more she packed up and set forth to find a home in Sweden's north, where none would recognise her beauty, or know, at least, it was their duty not to pester her with queries, or tell her all their silly theories of what Ninochka really meant. Such movie chatter always sent poor Greta into howling rage. She'd heard enough to last an age. So Greta found a rural house and settled there. No need to grouse about the locals, they were farmers. Good solid folk, not like the charmers and creeps who'd made her life a hell in Hollywood. Now she felt well. But peace can't last. Some months went by, and one by one the folks would try to be her friends. They bought her dishes, piled high with grub. Alas, her wishes for peace and quiet were wholly doomed. At night she dreamed she was entombed, and wept when she woke up alive. She saw that she could never thrive, while kindly souls would bring her food and ask if everything were good. Then one day came the final straw. She heard a scratching at the door. She opened up, and there she found a mangy-looking old black hound. A Labrador, to be exact. A sorry sight, and that's a fact. His coat was matted, caked with mud. His paws were red from his own blood. His eyes were dim, his body thin. He whimpered, "Won't you let me in?" But Greta's heart was ice and fog. "Leave me alone, you naughty dog." She was not moved. She slammed the door and cursed this pesky Labrador. The night soon came, and with it snow. The dog curled up. He would not go. He hoped the lady would be kind. He hoped that she would change her mind. Perhaps she would give him a bone, this goddess who lived here alone. That night Miss Garbo could not sleep. She tried and tried, but could not keep her mind from toying with wild plans. What place on earth was free from man's repulsive face? And woman's too. Where could she go? What should she do? But as dawn broke, the answer came. The land where no one knew her name was right on top of the whole world. She smiled at last, and snugly curled up in her sheets. She knew her goal. Garbo would go to the North Pole. She fell asleep and dreamed till noon. She roused herself, and then, quite soon, she dressed and gulped a coffee down and set off for the nearest town, where she would buy a one-way ticket to the deep north. Her wooden picket fence was almost swamped in snow. Its gate hung open, and below its wooden bars was a strange lump of thick packed flakes. It made her jump. She prayed that it was just a rock. She felt her cheeks go cold with shock. Surely that doggy must have known better than to stay there all alone. For surely the most stubborn hound would not have hugged the icy ground and let his warm life ebb away, never to bark another day. So Greta ran. With heaving breast she scraped snow from her doggy guest. He was quite still, but not quite stiff. She made a swift decision. If she brought this canine back inside and wrapped him up and really tried to snatch him from the jaws of death. And yet she saw no signs of breath. She pushed and pulled the frozen form inside, then set him down to warm by her wood stove. She took a towel and briskly rubbed him. Not a growl or whimper came from the poor dog. She paused and threw another log into the stove and rubbed again. She rubbed with all her might and main, and yet, however hard she'd try, he would not open up an eye. The world thought Garbo was aloof, but now she prayed for one quiet woof. She gave up and caressed his head. The dog was obviously dead. But then, how wonderful, how grand! She felt a rough tongue lick her hand, and icy Greta wept for joy. Hello again, you silly boy. Now that the dog was back to life, the actress played the role of wife. She gave him water, cooked him stews, washed his paws, and let him choose his place to sleep, or lightly nap. He would have crawled into her lap, but was too shy. She'd comb his fur, and it came as a surprise to her. She liked to pat his warm, smooth head, and when she went upstairs to bed, she felt herself inclined to cry, "Come on then, silly, beddy bye." But no, her bed was like a throne, designed for her and her alone. Instead, she'd merely say, "Good night," and went upstairs, but left one light so that the lab would not be scared. And this was the routine they shared. In his own way, the dog reflected, how nice it is to be protected. Contented, he began to snooze. He'd found his true love and his muse. She is my mistress and my saviour. I must show her my best behaviour. And when she came back from above, his eyes were all ablaze with love. Day followed day. The dog grew strong, so Greta let him come along when she went out to take her walk. The villagers began to talk. How odd to see their lovely hermit, so tolerant that she would permit a mangy hound to frisk and leap around her heels, while she would keep quite strictly to her usual path. Some gossiped, while their friends would laugh. Had their ice queen begun to melt? They watched her stroke her pooch's pelt. She never once had shown affection, yet now it seemed her cold perfection had finally begun to crack. And Greta? Her thoughts wandered back to Hollywood and misery. Things now felt different. Could it be that the pure love this dog had shown could soothe her ache to be alone? 2 weeks went past. Her mind returned to polar zones. Oh, how she burned to live away from human prattle. She'd sell her Swedish goods and chattels and book a passage on a ship. Alas, no place on such a trip for her new pal. For though it pained her just a bit, she still remained determined to escape mankind. She'd set him loose. Quite soon he'd find another warm and loving home. A mistress who, like her, would comb his fur, now sleek, and throw him sticks. No backward glances then. She'd fix her eyes on her Arctic ambition. No sentiment would thwart that mission. One afternoon she called a car and told the driver to go far and deep into the local woods, then set the dog free. No good for him to whimper, howl, or bark. Go now. The sky was growing dark. She watched the taxi till it vanished, hardened her heart, and tried to banish all fondness for her canine friend. Too bad, this had to be the end. She went indoors and up to bed, to rest before the trials ahead. Out in the woods, a lone dog cries, and howls his anguish to the skies. Did Greta feel the pangs of guilt? Well, yes, a bit, but she was built of sterner stuff by far than most. Her family had been a host of Viking warriors and bards. She found it easy to be hard. And all that night she slept quite sound and dreamed of sailing up around the coast of Sweden to seek bliss. Her dreams were thrilling as a kiss. When morning broke, she went and caught an early bus to the seaport to see if she could find some jolly Jack Tar to indulge her folly, some tolerant, obliging soul to sail her up to the North Pole. Her luck was good. Within a minute she'd found a wooden hut. Within it sat a fine chap with a vast beard, a captain. Though Greta had feared that no old salt would hear her plea, this fellow smiled and said that he would gladly take her to the pole. "No worries, miss," he said. His sole condition was she could not sail alone. And then he told his tales of Arctic travels gone to hell, of deaths and madness. He could tell 1,000 yarns of Arctic grief. He scratched his beard. His firm belief was that he did not dare to send a passenger who had no friend for company in polar zones. He would not let her sail alone. "But," Greta said, "I have no friend." He thought about this. In the end he said, "Okay, so here's my plan. You need not travel with a man or woman, but that's no disaster. I think that we can fix this faster if you'll agree to this one term. Find a good dog. I'm wholly firm on this. See, here's my captain's log. Sole passengers must bring a dog. He'll keep you safe and warm up there and chase away the polar bears." Greta was silent. Could it be that it was now her destiny to share her life with a canine? The captain noticed her eyes shine. Though Greta was not used to chums, she felt, deep down inside, a numb sensation of both loss and woe. She would not hesitate. She'd go straight back home, and if she could, track down her dog in the dark wood. But back home, much to her surprise, she saw a pair of liquid eyes. The Labrador! Some doggy sense had brought him right back to her fence. He did not know what she would do, for in his canine mind he knew that she had spurned his love. But now she patted him upon the brow, caressed his ears and rubbed his legs. He jumped and rolled and frisked and begged and danced around her, mad with joy. "It's good to see you, silly boy. Let's get you warm and dry." And then she led him back inside, and when he was quite warm she hugged him tight and stayed with him all that long night. They cuddled up on the bare floor, Greta and her Labrador. The next days went by in a flash, as Greta laid out piles of cash for all the things they'd surely need. She bought a suit of Harris tweed, thick boots for walking on the ice, and thicker books, full of advice on how to thrive in deadly cold. A starter's guide to igloos told how she could build a cosy home from blocks of ice. Another tome explained how best to hunt and fish in Arctic climes. Her dearest wish for solitude was coming true. Of course, she'd take her doggy too. She also shopped for good strong rope and bully beef and bars of soap, knives, harpoons, sponges, lamps, and oil. A fish kettle in which to boil the sprats she'd catch through little holes. No need to starve at the North Pole. At last she blew her final wedge on a fast-running, lightweight sledge. Her Labrador was clearly bright. He'd learned to pull this sledge all right. Soon it was time to leave, so she took all her kit down to the quay. The captain's greeting was quite hearty, as if their voyage would be a party. He took down a quick inventory of all her goods and heard the story of how the lab became her chum. He laughed and said, "All right then, come on board the ship. Oh, one last thing. Since you've decided that you'll bring that dog along, he looks quite tame. I really need to know his name, so I can keep our records straight." Silence. Would he have to wait forever for her answer? Yes, it seemed so. He could only guess why lovely Greta would not speak. A minute passed, and then a weak smile floated across Garbo's face. Sure, why not make this dock the place where she would give her dog a name? It would, let's face it, be a shame for her sweet pooch to stay anon. It was as if she'd somehow gone into a trance, and then she said, "Picus," and patted her dog's head. A shudder ran through her dog's frame. At last He had his own true name. The captain smiled. A splendid choice. Now, step on board before we hoist the anchor high and leave this port. So Greta and her male escort climbed up the gangplank eagerly. In half an hour they were at sea. The waves were calm, the sun was high. Seagulls played across the sky. Greta and Picus, side by side, watched the white birds as they would glide about the ship in search of food. Picus and Greta felt how good it was to voyage. They would stay up on the foredeck all that day and gaze back at the distant shore, Greta and her Labrador. Their ship was called the Arctic Crow, a merchant vessel which would go on frequent trips along the coast of Norway. Well, that was the most familiar journey, bearing cargo, just like the days of Wells and Fargo in the Wild West. For quick sails in Murmansk or Archangel, whales would swim beside her, frisking. But this time out the Crow was risking colder waters just for Greta, who stood on deck in her thick sweater and stared. Her eyes were even keener than in that shot from Queen Christina, in which the royal lady stands on a ship's prow. Her gloveless hands would sometimes give her dog a pat. He gazed up at her, happy that he'd found his true mistress at last. His miseries were in the past. He'd stay with her no matter what, and give her all the love he'd got. Their luck was good. That week the weather was fairly mild, and so, together, Greta and Picus trod the decks, felt the sea spray and craned their necks to see if they could spot some seals, or dolphins, sharks, or giant eels, or the Lofoten Islands, where the captain told his mate to bear due north. It was a real surprise. The crew had not been told. Loud cries of, "What's all this?" now rent the air. The skipper calmed them. "Lads, fair's fair. Each one of you gets triple pay. Just trust me, boys. You'll bless the day you men have signed on for the Crow. Now all we do is have to go as far as the first polar ice. We drop Miss Garbo off all nice and gently, then it's back to normal." The crew fell silent. True, no formal contract held them to this task, but triple pay? They could not ask for better terms. They soon agreed to push ahead. Don't call it greed, just a strong sense of their true worth. That night, tucked up inside her berth, with Picus at her feet, our Greta mused that it had gone much better than she had feared, and soon ahead was the North Pole. She let her head sink deep into the fluffy pillow. Outside the waves were merely billows. Picus watched her as she slept, and like all loyal dogs, he kept his eyes awake throughout the night. This was no chore, but pure delight. The Crow sailed on, up to the northern pole, just at the iron whim of one sole passenger, plus dog. What larks! They'd play with Picus, and his barks rang merrily about the ship. The air grew colder. Soon the trip would be successfully completed. Morale was good. The crew competed to see if one of them could thaw their pole star with a witty joke, or somehow make her laugh. No dice. She laughed with Picus, but stayed ice with all the jolly sailor boys. Then, finally, one day, "Ahoy!" the call rang out. "Pack ice ahead." She ran out from her soft warm bed with Picus at her heels. She gasped. Ahead of them there lay a vast and dazzling expanse of ice. To Greta, this was paradise. They gazed and gazed in silent awe, Greta and her Labrador. The Crow now touched the ice's edge. The crewmen lowered Greta's sledge and placed it safely on the ice. The captain gave some last advice. "Miss Garbo, take the greatest care. There's danger here from polar bears. Just radio if you need help. It seems to me that your black whelp's not company enough for you." But Greta stopped him. "That will do. My Picus is a splendid hound. With him I shall be safe and sound. Now tell your sailors to unload my things." And so the crewmen rowed their rowboats, and they brought ashore the rest of all Miss Garbo's store, of food and fuel and useful kit. The work took several hours, but it was still quite light when they had done. This is a land of midnight sun. The sledge was loaded, and at last they strapped brave Picus good and fast into his harness, gave a push, while Greta gaily shouted, "Moosh!" and set the sledge speeding away. She gave a wave as if to say, "This is goodbye, not au revoir." They watched her speed away, so far that she could not be seen. "What folly," they muttered. She will be jolly lucky to survive a year, or even weeks. Yes, it was clear that Greta's was an insane trip. They shrugged and went back to the ship. Now Picus, strapped into his traces, felt like a greyhound at the races. He pulled the sledge with all his might, while Greta laughed from sheer delight. They'd stop at times to pitch a tent to rest a while, and then they went right to our planet's very top. She checked her compass and said, "Stop." They had arrived. It was the pole. Pure happiness suffused her soul, and Picus, sensing how she felt, was happy too. The sight would melt the hardest heart. Actress and hound had overcome the odds and found a land where they could be content. One final time she pitched the tent. Tomorrow she would start to build a house of ice, sturdy and filled with all the kit she'd brought along. And as she built, she sang a song from her young days, a charming ditty. Her dog stayed quiet. What a pity he'd never learned to sing in tune. Greta worked fast, and very soon she'd built herself a fine igloo, a des res with a southern view from every side. And then she took her stores and filled up every nook with furniture and such like stuff, a table, chairs, and a good tough canvas to put upon the floor, plus lamps and stoves and much, much more. Within ice walls they're warm and snug. The Labrador sleeps on his rug, while Greta has her cosy bed with counterpane of white and red. They have adventures every day. She fishes, then they both will play at snowballs, slides, and other games. She calls her Picus silly names. At night they eat a meal of fish. The Labrador has his own dish, and listen to the gramophone. How glad I am to be alone, she thinks. With just my Labrador, it's everything that I hoped for. And so we reach our happy end. Miss Garbo has a special friend, and they'll stay friends forevermore, Greta and her Labrador.